Okay, you say I'm live. Do you mean it? Do you mean it? Are you sure? If it doesn't work this time, we're just gonna call it. Okay, nobody shows up. I really don't care because this is also therapeutic for me to do. So, trying that one more time. Alice in Wonderland, Chapter 1, Down the Rabbit Hole. Alice was beginning to get very tired of sitting by her sister on the bank and of having nothing to do. Once or twice she peeped into the book her sister was reading, but it had no pictures or conversations in it. And what is the use of a book, thought Alice, without pictures or conversations? So she was considering, in her own mind as well as she could, for the hot day made her feel very sleepy and stupid, whether the pleasure of making a daisy chain would be worth the trouble of getting up and picking the daisies, when suddenly a white rabbit with pink eyes ran close by her. There was nothing so very remarkable in that, nor did Alice think so very much out of the way to hear the rabbit say to itself, oh dear, I shall be too late. When she thought it over afterwards, it occurred to her that she ought to have wondered at this, but at the time it all seemed quite natural. But when the rabbit actually took a watch out of its waistcoat pocket and looked at it, and then hurried on, Alice started to her feet, for it flashed across her mind that she had never before seen a rabbit with either a waistcoat or a pocket, or a watch to take out of it. Burning with curiosity, she ran across the field after it, and was just in time to see it hop down a large rabbit hole under the hedge. In another moment Alice went in after it, never once considering how in the world she was to get out again. The rabbit hole went straight on like a tunnel for some way, then dipped suddenly down, so suddenly that Alice had not a moment to think about stopping herself before she found herself falling down what seemed to be a very deep well. Either the well was very deep, or she fell very slowly, for she had plenty of time as she went down to look about her and wonder what was going to happen next. First, she tried to look down and make out what she was coming to, but it was too dark to see anything. Then she looked at the sides of the well and noticed that they were filled with cupboards and bookshelves. Here and there she saw maps and pictures hung upon pegs. She took a jar from one of the shelves as she passed. It was labeled orange marmalade, but to her great disappointment, it was empty. She did not like to drop the jar for fear of killing someone underneath, so she managed to put it on one of the cupboards as she fell past it. Well, thought Alice to herself, after such a fall as this, I shall think nothing of tumbling downstairs. How brave they'll think of me at home. Why, I wouldn't say anything about it, even if I fell off the top of the house, which was very likely true. Down, down, down. Would it never come to an end? I wonder how many miles I've fallen by this time, she said aloud. I must be getting somewhere near the center of the earth. Let me see. That would be 4,000 miles down, I think. For you see, Alice had learnt several things of this sort in her lessons in the schoolroom, and thought this was a very good opportunity for showing off her knowledge, as there was no one to listen to her. Still, it was good practice to say it over. Yes, that's about the right distance. But then I wonder what latitude or longitude I've got to? Alice had not the slightest idea what latitude was, or longitude either, but she thought they were nice grand words to say. Presently she began again. I wonder if I shall fall right through the earth. How funny it'll seem to come out among all the people with all their heads downward. The antipathies, I think. She was rather glad there was no one listening this time, as that didn't sound at all the right word. But I shall have to ask them what the name of the country is, you know. Please, ma'am, is this New Zealand or Australia? And she tried to curtsy as she spoke. Fancy! Curtsying as you're falling through the air. Do you think you could manage it? And what an ignorant little girl she'll think of me for asking. No, it'll never do to ask. Perhaps I shall see it written up somewhere. Down, down, down. There was nothing else to do. So Alice soon began talking again. Dinah will miss me very much tonight, I should think. Dinah was the cat. I hope they'll remember her saucer of milk at tea time. Dinah, my dear, I wish you were down here with me. There are no mice in the air, I'm afraid, but you might catch a bat, and that's very like a mouse, you know. But do cats eat bats, I wonder? And here Alice began to get rather sleepy, and went on saying to herself, in a dreamy sort of way, do cats eat bats? Do cats eat bats? And sometimes, do bats eat cats? For you see, as she couldn't answer either question, it didn't matter much which way she put it. She felt that dozing off, and had just begun to dream she was walking hand in hand with Dinah, and was saying to her very earnestly, "Now, Dinah, tell me the truth. Did you ever eat a bat?" When suddenly, thump, thump, down she came upon a heap of sticks and dry leaves, and the fall was over. Alice was not hurt, a bit hurt, and she jumped up on her feet in a moment. She looked up, but it was all dark overhead. Before her was another long passage, and the White Rabbit was still in sight, hurrying down it. There was not a moment to be lost. Away went Alice like the wind, and she was just in time to hear it say, as it turned a corner, "Oh, my ears and whiskers, how late it's getting!" She was close behind it when it turned the corner, but the rabbit was no longer to be seen. She found herself in a long, low hall, which was lit up by a row of lamps hanging from the roof. There were doors all around the hall, but they were all locked, and when Alice had been all the way around, down one side, up the other, trying every door, she walked sadly down the middle, wondering how she was ever going to get out. Suddenly she came upon a three-legged little table, all made of solid glass. There was nothing on it but a tiny golden key, and Alice's first idea was that this might belong to one of the doors in the hall. But, alas, either the locks were too large, or the key was too small, but at any rate it would not open any of them. However, on the second time round, she came upon a low curtain she had not noticed before, and behind it was a little door about 15 inches high. She tried the little golden key in the lock, and to her great delight it fitted. Alice opened the door and found that it led to a small passage not much larger than a rat hole. She knelt down and looked along the passage into the loveliest garden you ever saw. How she longed to get out of that dark hall and wander among those beds of bright flowers and those cool fountains, but she could not even get her head through the doorway. And if my head would go through, thought poor Alice, it would be of very little use without my shoulders. Oh, how I wish I could shut up like a telescope. I think I could, if only I knew how to begin. For, you see, so many out of the way things had happened lately that Alice had begun to think that very few things indeed were really impossible. There seemed to be no use in waiting by the little door, so she went back to the table, half hoping she might find another key in it, or at any rate a book of rules for shutting people up like telescopes. This time she found a little bottle on it, which certainly was not here before, said Alice, and tied round the neck of the bottle was a paper label with the words "Drink Me" beautifully printed in large letters. It was all very well to say "Drink me," but the wise little Alice was not going to do that in a hurry. "No, I'll look first," she said, "and see whether it's marked poison or not." For she had read several little nice stories about children who had got burnt and eaten up by wild beasts and other unpleasant things, all because they would not remember the simple rules their friends had taught them, such as that if a red-hot poker will burn you if you hold it too long, and that if you cut your finger very deeply with a knife, it usually bleeds. And she had never forgotten that, if you drank from a bottle marked poison, it is almost certain to disagree with you sooner or later. However, this bottle was not marked poison, so Alice ventured to taste it, and finding it very nice, it had, in fact, sort of a mixed flavor of cherry tart, custard, pineapple, roast turkey, toffee, and hot buttered toast, she very soon finished it off. "What a curious feeling," said Alice. "I must be shutting up like a telescope." And so it was indeed. She was now only 10 inches high. Her face brightened up as she thought she was the right size for going through the little door into the lovely garden. First, however, she waited a few minutes to see if she was going to shrink any farther. She felt a little nervous about this, for it might end, said Alice to herself, in my going out altogether, like a candle. I wonder what I should be like then. And she tried to fancy what a flame of a candle looks like after the candle is blown out, for she could not remember ever having seen such a thing. After a while, finding nothing more happened, she decided to go into the little garden at once. But alas for poor Alice, when she got to the door, she found that she had forgotten the little golden key, and when she went back to the table for it, she found she could not possibly reach it. She could see it quite plainly through the glass, and she tried her best to climb up one of the legs of the table, but it was too slippery. And when she had tired herself out with trying, the poor little thing sat down and cried. Come, there's no use in crying like that, said Alice to herself rather sharply. I advise you to leave off this minute. She generally gave herself very good advice, though she very seldom followed it. And sometimes she scolded herself so severely as to bring tears into her eyes. And once she remembered trying to box her own ears for having cheated herself in a game of croquet she was playing against herself, for this curious child was very fond of pretending to be two people at once. But it's no use now, thought poor Alice, to pretend to be two people. Why, there's hardly enough of me left to make one respectable person. Soon her eyes fell on a little glass box that was lying under the table. She opened it and found it in a very small cake, in which the words "Eat me" were beautifully marked in currants. Well, I'll eat that, said Alice, and if it makes me grow larger, I can reach the key, and if it makes me grow smaller, I can creep under the door. So either way, I will get into the garden, and I don't care what happens. She ate a little bit, and said anxiously to herself, "Which way? Which way?" holding her head up to the top holding her hand to the top of her head to feel which way it was growing. And she was quite surprised to find that she remained the same size. To be sure, this is generally what happens when one eats cake. But Alice had got so much into the way of expecting nothing but out of the way things to happen that it seemed quite dull and stupid for life to go on in the common way. So she set to work and very soon finished off the cake. Chapter 2: The Pool of Tears. Curiouser and curiouser, cried Alice. She was so much surprised that for a moment she quite forgot to speak good English. Now I'm opening up for the largest telescope that ever was. Goodbye, feet. For, when she looked down at her feet, they seemed to be almost out of sight. They were getting so far off. Oh, my poor little feet. I wonder who will put your shoes and stockings on for you now, dears. I'm sure I shan't be able. I shall be a great deal too far off to trouble myself about you. You must manage the best way you can. But I must be kind to them, thought Alice, or perhaps they won't walk the way I want them to go. Let me see. I'll give them a new pair of boots every Christmas. And she went on planning to herself now that she might manage it. They must go by the carrier, she thought, and how funny it'll seem sending presents to one's own feet, and how odd the directions will look. Alice's right foot, Esquire, Hearthrug, near the fender, with Alice's love. Oh dear, what nonsense I'm talking! Just at this moment her head struck the roof of the hall. In fact, she was now quite more than 9 feet high, and she at once took up the little golden key and hurried off to the garden door. Poor Alice! It was as much as she could do, lying down on one side, to look into the garden with one eye, but to get through was more hopeless than ever. She sat down and began to cry again. You ought to be ashamed of yourself, said Alice. A great girl like you, she might well say this, to go crying this way. Stop this moment, I tell you. But she went on all the same, shedding gallons of tears, until there was a large pool all around her, about 4 inches deep, and reaching half down the hall. After a time, she heard a little pattering of feet in the distance, and she hastily dried her eyes to see what was coming. It was the White Rabbit returning, splendidly dressed, with a pair of white gloves in one hand and a large fan in the other. He came trotting in a great hurry, muttering to himself as he came, "Oh, the Duchess, the Duchess! Oh, won't she be savage if I've kept her waiting?" Alice felt so desperate she was ready to ask for help of anyone, so when the rabbit came near her, she began in a low, timid voice, "If you please, sir." The rabbit started violently, dropped the white gloves and the fan, and scurried away into the darkness as hard as he could go. Alice took up the fan and the gloves, and, as the hall was very hot, she kept fanning herself all the time that she went on talking. Dear, dear, how queer everything is today. And yesterday things went on just as usual. I wonder if I've changed in the night. Let me think. Was I the same when I got up this morning? I almost can remember feeling a little different. But if I'm not the same, the next question is, who in the world am I? Ah, that's the great puzzle. And she began thinking over all the children she knew that were the same age as herself to see if she could be any changed for any of them. I'm sure I'm not Ada, she said, for her hair goes in such long ringlets, and mine doesn't go in ringlets at all. I'm sure I can't be Mabel, for I know all sorts of things, and oh, she knows such a very little. Besides, she's she, and I'm I, and oh dear, how puzzling it all is. I'll try if I know all the things I used to know. Let me see. 4 times 5 is 12, and 4 times 6 is 13, and 4 times 7 is, oh dear, I shall never get to 20 at that rate. However, the multiplication table doesn't signify. Let's try geography. London is the capital of Paris, and Paris is the capital of Rome, and Rome, no, that's all wrong, I'm certain. I must have been changed from Mabel. I'll try and say, how doth the little, and she crossed her hands on her lap, as if she were saying lessons, and began to repeat it. But her voice sounded hoarse and strange, and the words did not come out the same as they used to do. How doth the little crocodile improve his shining tail, and pour the waters of the Nile on every golden scale? How cheerily he seems to grin, how neatly spreads his claws, and welcomes little fishes in with gently smiling jaws. I'm sure those are not the right words, said poor Alice, and her eyes filled with tears again as she went on. I must be Mabel after all, and I shall have to go and live in that poky little house, and I have to learn next to no toys to play with, and oh, ever so many lessons to learn. No, I've made up my mind about it. If I'm Mabel, I'll stay down here. It'll be no use their putting their heads down and saying, "Come up again, dear." I shall only look up and say, "Who am I, then? Tell me that first, and if I like being that person, I'll come up. If not, I'll stay down here till I'm somebody else. But oh dear," cried Alice with a sudden burst of tears, "I do wish they would put their head down. I am so very tired of being all alone here." As she said this, she looked down at her hands, and was surprised to see that she had put on one of the rabbit's little white gloves while she was talking. "How can I have done that?" she thought. "I must be growing small again." She got up and went to the table and measured herself by it, and found that, as nearly as she could guess, she was now about 2 feet high, and was going on shrinking rapidly. She soon found out that the cause of this was the fan she was holding, and she dropped it rather hastily, just in time to save herself from shrinking away altogether. "That was a narrow escape," said Alice, a good deal frightened at the sudden change, but very glad to find herself still in existence. "And now for the little garden." And she ran with all speed back to the little door. But alas, the little door was shut again, and the golden key was lying on the glass table as before. "Things are worse than ever," thought the poor child, "for I shall never be as small as this before, never, and I declare it's too bad, that it is." As she said this, her foot slipped, and another moment, splash, she was up to her chin in salt water. Her first idea was that she had somehow fallen into the sea. "And in that case, I can go back by railway," she said to herself. Alice had been to the seaside once in her life, and had come to the general conclusion that wherever you go on the English coast, you find a number of bathing machines in the sea, some children digging in the sand with wooden spades, then a row of lodging houses, and behind them a railway station. However, she soon made out of the way that she was in the pool of tears that she had wept when she was 9 feet high. "I wish I hadn't cried so much," said Alice. She swam about, trying to find her way out. "I shall be punished for it now, I suppose, by being drowned in my own tears. That will be a queer thing, to be sure. However, everything is queer today." Just then she heard something splashing about in the pool a little way off, and she swam nearer to make out what it was. At first she thought it must be a walrus or a hippopotamus, but then she remembered how small she was now, and she soon made her way that it was only a mouse that had slipped in like herself. Would it be of any use now, thought Alice, to speak with this mouse? Everything is so out of the way down here that I should think it can very likely talk. At any rate, there's no harm in trying. So she began, "Oh, Mouse, do you know the way out of this pool? I am very tired of swimming about here, oh, Mouse." Alice thought this must be the right way of speaking to a mouse. She had never done such a thing before, but she remembered having seen in her brother's Latin grammar, "A mouse of a mouse to a mouse, oh, mouse." The mouse looked at her rather inquisitively, and seemed to her to wink with one of its little eyes, but it said nothing. "Perhaps it doesn't understand English," thought Alice. "I dare say it's a French mouse, come over with William the Conqueror," for, with all her knowledge of history, Alice had no clear notion of how long ago anything had happened. So she began again, "Ois et machete?" I can't speak French, sorry. Which was the first sentence in her French lesson book. The mouse gave a sudden leap out of the water, and seemed to quiver all over with fright. "Oh, I beg your pardon," cried Alice hastily, afraid that she had hurt the poor animal's feelings. "I quite forgot you didn't like cats." "Not like cats?" said the mouse in a shrill, passionate voice. "Would you like cats if you were me?" "Well, perhaps not," said Alice in a soothing tone. "Don't be angry about it. And yet I wish I could show you our cat Dinah. I think you'd take a fancy to cats if you could only see her. She is such a dear, quiet thing," Alice went on, half to herself, as she swam lazily in the pool, "and she sits purring so nicely by the fire, licking her paws and washing her face, and she is such a nice, soft thing to nurse. And she's such a capital one for catching mice." "Oh, I beg your pardon," cried Alice again, for this time the mouse was bristling all over, and she felt certain it must be really offended. "We won't talk about her any more if you'd rather not." "We, indeed!" cried the mouse, who was trembling down to the end of its tail. "As if I would talk on such a subject! Our family always hated cats. Nasty, low, vulgar things. Don't let me hear the name again." "I won't, indeed," said Alice, in a hurry to change the subject of conversation. "Are you fond of dogs?" The mouse did not answer, so Alice went on eagerly. "There is such a nice little dog near our house. I should like to show it to you. A bright little eared a bright eye a little bright-eyed terrier, you know, with oh such long curly brown hair, and it'll fetch things when you throw them, and it'll sit up and beg for its dinner, and all sorts of things. I can't remember half of them, and it belongs to a farmer, you know, and he says it's so useful, it's worth £100. He says it kills all the rats, and oh dear," cried Alice in a sorrowful tone, "I'm afraid I've offended it again." For the mouse was swimming away from her as hard as it could go, and making quite a commotion in the pool as it went. So she softly called after it, "Mouse dear, do you wish to come back again? We won't talk about cats, or dogs either, if you don't like them." When the mouse heard this, it turned round and swam slowly back to her. Its face was quite pale with passion, Alice thought, and it said in a low, trembling voice, "Let us get to the shore, and I'll tell you my history, and you'll understand why it is I hate cats and dogs." It was high time to go, for the pool was getting quite crowded with birds and animals that had fallen into it. There was a duck and a dodo and a lory and an eaglet and several other curious creatures. Alice led the way, and the whole party swam to shore. Chapter 3. A dodo and a lory and an eaglet and several other curious creatures. Alice led the way, and the whole party swam to shore. Chapter 3. Being wet, cross, and uncomfortable. The first question, of course, was how to get dry again. They had a consultation about this, and after a few minutes it seemed quite natural to Alice, who seemed to be a person of some authority among them, called out, "Sit down, all of you, and listen to me. I'll soon make you dry enough." They all sat down. "Ahem!" said the mouse with an important air. "Are you all ready? This is the driest thing I know. Silence all round, if you please." "William the Conqueror, whose cause was favored by the Pope, who soon submitted by the English, who wanted leaders, and who had been of late much accustomed to usurpation and conquest. Edwin and the Morcar, the Earls of Mercia and Northumbria, and even the Stignand, the patriotic Archbishop of Canterbury, found it advisable." "Found what?" said the duck. "When I find a thing, it's generally a frog or a worm. The question is, what did the Archbishop find?" The mouse did not notice this question, but hurriedly went on. found it advisable to go with Edgar Atheling to meet William and offer him the crown. William's conduct at first was moderate, but the insolence of his Normans— "How are you getting on now, my dear?" it continued, turning to Alice as it spoke. "As wet as ever," said Alice in a melancholy tone. "It doesn't seem to dry me at all." "In that case," said the Dodo solemnly, rising to its feet, "I move that the meaning of long words, and what's more, I don't believe you do either." And the eaglet bent down its head to hide a smile. Some of the other birds tittered audibly. "What I was going to say," said the Dodo in an offended tone, "was the best thing to get us dry would be a caucus race." "What is a caucus race?" said Alice. Not that she much wanted to know. The Dodo had paused as if it thought somebody ought to speak, and no one seemed inclined to say anything. "Why," said the Dodo, "the best way to explain it is to do it. And, as you might like to try the thing yourself some winter day, I will tell you how the Dodo managed it. First it marked out a race course in a sort of circle. The exact shape doesn't matter, right? And so it was not easy to know when the race was over. However, when they had been running half an hour or so and were quite dry again, the Dodo suddenly called out, 'The race is over!' And they all crowded around it, panting and asking, 'But who has won?' This question the Dodo could not answer, while the rest waited in silence. At last the Dodo said, 'Everybody has won, and all must have prizes.' 'But who is to give the prizes?' the chorus of voices asked. 'Why, she, of course,' said the Dodo, pointing to Alice with one finger, and the whole party at once crowded round her, calling out in fits. Luckily the salt water had not got into it, and handed them round as prizes. There was exactly one apiece, all around. 'But she must have a prize herself,' said the Mouse. 'Of course,' the Dodo replied very gravely. 'What else have you got in your pocket?' it went on, turning to Alice. 'Sandy,' she added in a whisper, half afraid that it would be offended again. 'Mine is a long, sad tale,' said the Mouse, turning to Alice, sighing. 'It is a long tale, certainly,' looking down with wonder at the Mouse's tail, 'but why do you call it sad?' And she kept on puzzling and will prosecute you. Come, I'll take no denial, we must have the trial, for really this morning I've nothing to do.' Said the Mouse to the Cur, 'Such a trial, dear sir, with no jury or judge, would be wasting our breath.' 'I'll be the judge, I'll be the jury,' said the cunning old furry. 'I'll try the whole cause, and condemn you to death.' 'You are not attending,' said the Mouse to Alice severely. 'What are you thinking of?' 'I beg your pardon,' said Alice very humbly. 'You had got to the fifth bend, I think?' 'I had our Dinah here, I know I do,' said Alice aloud, addressing nobody in particular. 'She'd soon fetch it back. And who is Dinah, if I'm catching mice? You can't think. Oh, and I wish you could see her after the birds. Why, she'll eat a little bird just as soon as look at it.' This speech caused— I really must be getting home. The night air doesn't suit my throat. And a canary called out in a trembling voice to its children, 'Come away, my dears, it's high time you were all in bed.' On various pretexts they all moved off, and Alice was soon alone. 'I wish I hadn't mentioned Dinah,' she said to herself in a melancholy tone. 'Nobody seems to like her down here, and I'm sure she's the best cat in the world. Oh, my dear Dinah, I wonder if I shall ever see you any more.' And here poor Alice began to cry again, for she felt very lonely and low-spirited. In a little while, however, she soon again heard a pattering of footsteps in the distance. She looked up eagerly, half hoping that the Mouse had changed his mind and was coming back to finish his story. Chapter 4. It was the White Rabbit, trotting slowly back again, and was looking anxiously about as it went, as if it had lost something, and she heard it muttering to it. Alice guessed in a moment it was looking for the fan and the pair of white kid gloves, and she very good-naturedly began hunting about for them, but they were nowhere to be seen. Everything seemed to have changed since her swim in the pool, and in the great hall, the glass table and the little door had vanished completely. Very soon the rabbit noticed Alice, and she went hunting about and calling at her in an angry voice, 'Why, Marianne, what are you doing out here? Run home this moment, fetch me a pair of gloves and a fan. Quick now, run!' And Alice was so much frightened that she ran off at once in the direction that it pointed to, without trying to explain them to take him his fan and gloves, that is, if I can find them. As she said this, She came upon a neat little house, on the door of which was a bright brass plate with the name W. Rabbit engraved on it. She went in without knocking, and hurried upstairs, in great fear as to herself, to be going messages for a rabbit. I suppose Dinah will be sending me on messages next. She began fancying the sort of thing the mouse doesn't get out. Only I don't think, Alice went on, that they'd let Dinah stop in the house if she began ordering people about like that. By this time she had found her way into a tiny little room with a table in the window, and on it, as she had hoped, a fan and 2 or 3 pairs of tiny white kid gloves. She took up the fan and the pair of gloves, and was just going to leave the room when her eye fell upon a little bottle that stood near the looking-glass. There was no label this time with the words "Drink me," but nevertheless she uncorked it and put it to her lips. I know something interesting is sure to have such a tiny thing. It did so indeed, and much sooner than she had expected. Before she had drunk half the bottle, she soon found her head pressing against the ceiling, and she had to stoop to save her neck from being broken. She hastily put down the bottle, saying to herself, "That's quite enough. I hope I shan't grow any more. As it is, I can't get out the door. I do wish I hadn't drunk quite so much." Alas, it was too late to wish that. She went on growing, and very soon had to kneel down on the floor. In another minute there was not even room for this, and she tried the effect of lying down with one elbow against the door, and the other said to herself, "Now I can do no more, whatever happens." Luckily for Alice, the magic little bottle had had its full effect, and she grew no larger. Still, it was very uncomfortable, as there seemed to be no chance of her ever getting out of the room. No wonder she felt unhappy. It was much pleasanter at home, thought poor Alice, where one wasn't always growing and larger and smaller, and being ordered about by mice and rabbits. I almost wish I hadn't gone down the rabbit hole. And yet, it's rather curious, this sort of life. I do wonder what can have happened to me. When I used to read fairy tales, I fancied that the kind of thing never happened, and now here I am in the middle of one. There ought to be a book written about me, that there ought. And when I grow up, I'll write one. But I'm grown up now," she added sorrowfully. "At least there's no room to grow up any more here. But then to learn. Oh, I shouldn't like that." "Oh, you foolish Alice," she answered herself. "How can you learn lessons in here? Why, there's hardly room for you, and no room at all for lesson books." And so she went on, taking the first side and then the other, quite making conversation of it altogether. But after a few minutes Alice knew it was the rabbit coming to look for her, and she trembled till she shook the house, quite forgetting that she was now about 1,000 times as large as the rabbit, and had no reason to be afraid of it. Presently the rabbit came up to the door, tried to open it, but as the door opened inward, and Alice's elbow and, after waiting till she fancied she heard the rabbit just under the window, she suddenly spread out her hand and made a snatch for it in the air. She did not get hold of anything, but she heard a little shriek and a fall, and a crash of broken glass, from which she concluded that it was just possible it had fallen onto a cucumber frame, or something of that sort. Next came an angry voice, the rabbit's. "Pat, Pat, where are you?" And then a voice she had never heard before. "Sure, I'm here, digging for apples, your honor." "Digging for apples, indeed," said the rabbit angrily. "Here, come and help me out of this." Sounds of more broken glass. "One that size! Why, it fills the whole window." "Sure it does, your honor, but it's an arm for all that." I don't know what accent was supposed to be after this, and Alice could only hear whispers now and then, such as, "Sure, I don't like it, your honor, and all," and "Do as I tell you, you coward," and at last she spread out her hand again and made another snatch in the air. This time there were 2 little shrieks and more sounds of broken glass. "What a number of cucumber frames there must be," thought Alice. I wonder what they'll do next. As for pulling me out of the window, I only wish they could. I'm sure I don't want to stay in here any longer." She waited for some time without hearing anything more. At last came a rumbling of little cartwheels, and the sound of a good many voices all talking together. She made out the words, "Where's the other ladder? Why, I hadn't bring this one. Bill's got the ladder. Bill, fetch it here, lad. Here, put 'em up at this corner. No, tie 'em together first. They don't reach half the high enough yet. Oh, they'll do well enough. Don't be particular. Here, Bill, catch hold of this rope. Will the roof bear? Mind that loose slate. Oh, it's coming down. Heads below." A loud crash. Now, who did that? It was Bill, I fancy. Who's gone down the chimney? Nay, I shan't. You do it. That I won't, then. Bill's got to go down. Here, Bill, the master says you've got to go down the chimney. Oh, so Bill's going to come down the chimney, has he? Said Alice to herself. Why, they seem to put everything upon Bill. I wouldn't be in Bill's place for a good deal. This fireplace is narrow, but I think what it was, scratching and scrambling in the chimney close above her. Then, saying to herself, This is Bill, she gave one sharp kick and waited to see what would happen next. The first thing she heard was a general chorus of, There goes Bill! Then the rabbit's voice alone, Catch him, by the hedge! Then silence, then another confusion of voices. Hold us up his head! Brandy now, don't choke him. How was it, old fellow? What happened to you? Last came a little feeble, squeaking voice. That's Bill, thought Alice. Well, I hardly know. No more, thank you. I'm better now. But I'm a deal too flustered to tell you. All I know is something comes at me like a jack-in-the-box, and up I goes like a skyrocket. So you did, old fellow, said the others. Almost burned down the house, said the rabbit's voice. And Alice called out, If you do, I'll set Dinah at you. There was dead silence instantly, and Alice thought to herself, I wonder what they will do next. If they had any sense, they'd take the roof off. After a minute or two, they began moving about again, and Alice heard the rabbit say, A barrelful will do to begin with. A barrelful of what? Thought Alice. But she had not long to doubt, for the next moment a shower of pebbles came raining in at the window, and some of them hit her in the face. I'll put a stop to this, she said to herself, and shouted out, You better not do that again, which produced another dead silence. Alice noticed, with some surprise, that the pebbles were all turning into little cakes that as they lay on the floor, and the bright idea came into her head. If I eat one of these cakes, she thought, it's sure to make some change in my size. So she swallowed one of the little cakes and was delighted to find she began shrinking directly. As soon as she was small enough to get through the door, she ran out of the house and found quite a crowd of little animals and little birds waiting outside. The poor little lizard, Bill, was in the middle, being held up by two guinea pigs, who were giving it something out of a bottle. They all made a rush at Alice the moment she appeared, but she ran as hard as she could and soon found herself safe in a thick wood. The first thing I've got to do, said Alice to herself as she wandered about in the wood, is grow to my right size again. And the second thing is to find my way into that lovely garden. I think that will be the best plan. It sounded an excellent plan, no doubt, and very neatly and simply arranged. The only difficulty was she had not the smallest idea how to set about it, and when she was just peering about anxiously among the trees, a little sharp bark just over her head made her look up in a great hurry. An enormous puppy was looking down at her with large round eyes and feebly stretching out one paw, trying to touch her. Poor little thing, said Alex in a coaxing tone, and she tried hard to whistle to it. She was terribly frightened all the time at the thought that it might be hungry, in which case it would be very likely to eat her up. Hardly knowing what she did, she picked up a little bit of stick and held it out to the puppy, whereupon the puppy jumped in the air with all its feet at once with a yelp of delight and rushed at the stick and made believe to worry it. Then Alice dodged behind a great thistle to keep herself from being run over, and in the moment she appeared on the other side, the puppy made another rush at the stick and tumbled head over heels in its great hurry to get a hold of it. Then Alice, thinking it was very like having a game of play with a cart horse, and expecting every moment to be trampled under its feet, ran round the thistle again. Then the puppy began a series of short charges at the stick, running a very little way forward each time and a long way back, till at last it sat down a good way off, panting, with its tongue hanging out of its mouth, and its great eyes half shut. This seemed to Alice a good opportunity for making her escape, so she set off at once, and ran till she was quite tired and out of breath, and till the puppy's bark sounded quite faint in the distance. Yet what a dear little puppy it was, said Alice, and she leaned back against a buttercup to rest herself, and fanned herself with one of the leaves. I should have liked to teaching it tricks very much, if only I'd been the right size to do so. Oh dear, I'd nearly forgotten I'd managed to grow up again. Let me see, how is it to be managed? I suppose I ought to eat or drink something or other. But the great question is, what? The great question certainly was, what? Alice looked all around her at the flowers and blades of grass, but she could not see anything that looked the right thing to eat or drink under the circumstances. There was a large mushroom growing near her, at the same height as herself, and when she looked under it, on both sides of it, and behind it, it occurred to her she might as well look to see what was at the top of it. She stretched herself upon the tiptoe and peeped over the edge of the mushroom, and her eyes immediately met those of a large blue caterpillar that was sitting on top, with arms folded, quietly smoking a long hookah, and taking not the smallest notice of her or anything else. And I think that's a good stopping point. Um, I'm sorry if you just tuned in. I just saw somebody just started, but I think that's a good stopping point for tonight. But next stream will start on chapter 5, Advice from a Caterpillar. Thanks for tuning in. I hope this has been a pleasant distraction for you. Have a good night.